If you're into astrology, you'll have heard a lot of talk about the Pluto return of the United States over the last few years. And in this video, I'm going to try and answer a couple of important questions about the Pluto return. What was it really about? And is it over yet? But as ever on this channel, we use history as our guide. So to help us understand the Pluto return of the United States, we're going to examine the Pluto returns of a nation old enough to have had several of them already. The country I'm from, England. We're going to see how England's Pluto returns have coincided with key power struggles and civil conflict that reconfigured the country. And then we're going to turn back to the United States and think about what's happened to the US since the 3 exact hits of the Pluto return in 2022. So grab a drink and settle in for an astrological journey through history and the current moment. It might help us understand what the future holds for the United States. Dear friends, onward. Now, if you're not sure what I mean by return, it just means when a planet returns to the position it was in at the time someone or something was born. And so it's the end of an old cycle and the beginning of a new one. The best known return in astrology is undoubtedly the Saturn return, which happens roughly every 29.5 years when Saturn returns to its natal position. But Pluto moves a lot slower than Saturn. It takes around 248 years for Pluto to return to its natal position. So needless to say, humans don't experience Pluto returns, but institutions and nations do. So it's to the history books that we have to turn if we want to understand more about Pluto returns. Now, of course, Pluto, or Hades in Greek and Roman myth, was the god of the underworld. And in astrology, Pluto signifies death rebirth processes, deep transformations, war and destruction, control, manipulation, secrecy, crime, and power. Pluto also has to do with great wealth. Think of the words plutocracy and plutocrat. And remember that those things that were most precious in the ancient world, and still to this day, are things like gems and precious metals that were found in Pluto's subterranean realm. So now, to get more perspective on the Pluto return, we're going to look to English history. Now, this isn't intended to exclude my friends from the British Isles. We'll see that English history is closely entwined with that of its neighbouring countries soon enough. Now, as with any old nation, there are lots of charts we could use for England as it's been reborn many times over the centuries. But the one we're going to focus on here was for December the 25th, 1066. This was the day that the Norman invader, William the Conqueror, was crowned King of England in London after his famous victory at the Battle of Hastings. In other words, this was the time when poor England was colonized. And even today, people in England with Norman surnames, after 1,000 years, are still on average wealthier than those with Anglo-Saxon names. So here's the chart for 12 p.m. on December the 25th, 1066. We can see that Pluto is at 3 degrees and 50 minutes of Pisces. So if we zoom through time almost 250 years into the future, we find that the first exact hits of England's first Pluto return took place in 1310 and 1311. But as always in astrology, we'll use an orb. So if we take a 15-degree orb for the Pluto return, we can say the Pluto return lasted from about 1299 until 1322. But what was going on at this time?
I am William Wallace.
Yes, this was the period of the First War of Scottish Independence. The war immortalized in Mel Gibson's Braveheart. The blockbuster centered around one of the Scottish rebellion leaders, William Wallace. Wallace won some great battles, but eventually he was captured and killed by the English. And this war began after King Edward I of England invaded Scotland in 1296. Interestingly, with Pluto in Aquarius. Now, eventually, after many years of conflict, Scotland won her independence under King Robert the Bruce. But remember that power is a Plutonian theme, and in this period, we saw a failed attempt by England to assert power over neighbouring Scotland. Now let's fast forward another 248-year Pluto cycle. The next time Pluto returned to 3 degrees and 50 minutes of Pisces was in 1555 and 1556. This is the period of the Renaissance and the Protestant Reformation. The return was in play between roughly 1544 and 1569. We see a pivotal moment in the history of English power during this period, because in 1546, King Henry VIII established the Royal Navy. The establishment of this navy eventually allowed England or Britain to establish an enormous global empire. This is going to become relevant when we look at the United States Pluto return again shortly. But a few years ago, while Pluto had been in Aquarius, Henry had dramatically broken with Rome and declared himself supreme head of the Church of England. This is something I've talked about in some of my videos on Pluto and Aquarius. But following Henry's death in 1547, the country itself entered a period of crisis because Henry's daughter, Mary I, the first woman to sit on the English throne, attempted to reverse the English Reformation and return the country to Catholicism. Hundreds of Protestants were burned alive on Mary's orders, which earned her the nickname Bloody Mary. Of course, across history, the Protestants weren't innocent either. But it wasn't until Mary's death in 1558 that her successor, Elizabeth I, reversed this policy and re-established Protestantism as the dominant religion. And we should also bear in mind here the elemental age of the time, because this was an age of water, when Jupiter-Saturn conjunctions were happening in the water signs of Cancer, Scorpio, and Pisces. And the watery themes are loud here. We have Henry VIII establishing the Royal Navy, and we have a power struggle over religion. Religion's always a huge theme during ages of water. If you're enjoying this episode, please do me a favor, click that like button. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel already and you're enjoying this content, why not subscribe and make sure you don't miss future videos. Thanks. And now let's fast forward again to the next Pluto return, 1800 and 1801. This Pluto return would have been within our 15-degree orb between 1789 and 1813. And this period is very interesting in terms of the theme of British power, because the United States established its institutions in 1789, so we have a new power center being established that was formerly controlled by England. And Ireland enters the picture here, because Ireland had long been a colonial possession of England, but in 1798, the Irish rose up in rebellion against the English and attempted to gain independence. This time, the English crushed the rebellion, and in 1801, the Act of Union of Great Britain and Ireland came into force, creating the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. This was the first time that the term United Kingdom was used. And around the same period, Britain fought several wars against powerful foes, notably in the Napoleonic Wars, including the Battle of Trafalgar. Now, Britain ultimately emerged from this period with her own independence and empire intact.
Stop now, or we will destroy your ship. English whaler, this is your last warning. Stop now, or we will destroy you. Let's fly!
But to summarize, England's Pluto returns have had to do with monumental power struggles, which redefined it in important ways. And we saw the establishment of the Royal Navy in one of them, an important moment in the history of British power. Now let's move back to thinking about the United States. Pluto was at 27 degrees and 33 minutes of Capricorn at the US Declaration of Independence in 1776. Pluto returned to that position 3 times in 2022, in February, July, and for the last time on December the 28th of that year. But if we apply a 15-degree orb, as we did before, we can say that the Pluto return began around 2014. With that in mind, the Trump presidency would stand out as an obvious manifestation of the Pluto return. And as I argued in my recent video on Pluto through the 5 bounds of Capricorn, Trump became a kind of Plutonian vehicle of transformation for the United States. Part of his role seems to have been to bring hidden truths from the underbelly of American life into daylight. And he played a part in a process that ultimately transformed American institutions, but heightened the division in American politics and society. And of course, those divisions express themselves most clearly during the Capitol riot of January 2021. And unfortunately, there are astrological reasons to think that these divisions may get worse before they get better. 2 of the more ominous indications in that respect are the eclipses that are happening over the country and Uranus's coming transit through Gemini, which has historically coincided with the big transformative armed conflicts which reshaped American institutions. If you want to hear more about this, I suggest you watch the video I made on this subject with S.J. Anderson. You can find it on my channel page. But going back to Trump, there's something else he did, which I think is a manifestation of the Pluto return, and it has to do with military power. Remember how we saw Henry VIII establish the Royal Navy at England's second Pluto return? Well, in December 2019, President Trump signed the 2020 National Defense Authorization Act, which established the United States Space Force.
Today, space is essential not only to our way of life, it's absolutely critical to the modern way of war. GPS, ATMs, cell phones, gas pumps, traffic lights, power grids, guided missiles, surveillance, RPAs, ground combat control. There's no such thing as a day without space operations. You just don't see them.
The US Space Force now has 8,600 military personnel and 77 spacecraft. It's also interesting to note that this happened right at the transition into the Age of Air. The Age of Water brings a navy, an Age of Air brings a space force. I think future astrologer historians will look back on the establishment of the Space Force as one of the most important manifestations of this Pluto return. The first hit of the Pluto return came in February 2022, which is a month that will go down in the history books. This is the month that Vladimir Putin's Russia invaded Ukraine, of course. And if you've listened to some of the reasons that Putin has given for the invasion, he's talked a lot about his desire to overthrow the current United States-led global order. This war isn't just about Russia and Ukraine, it does have to do with American power. Since the early 90s and the fall of the Soviet Union, the United States has been the globally dominant superpower. But with the invasion, Putin seems to be trying to reverse that order and remove American influence on Ukraine. So as happened during the English Pluto returns, American power is being challenged here. But I think there's more going on with the Pluto return, and we can see it if we look again at the United States chart. Now we're going to look at the chart that's known as the Sibley chart, using a time given by the English occultist Ebenezer Sibley of about 5 p.m. on July the 4th, 1776. And you can see that in this chart it has Sagittarius rising, and that puts Pluto in Capricorn in the second whole sign house of the chart. And as many of you will know, this is the house of resources, of money. Last year, in response to the Russian invasion, the US and its Western allies launched a raft of heavy sanctions against Russia. These sanctions included freezing $350 billion in Russian assets, including the foreign currency reserves owned by Russia's central bank, and they limited the ability of Russian banks to access the SWIFT system, which is the international payment system. This had a serious effect, but not just on Russia. Many countries of the world who assumed that their foreign reserves couldn't be targeted in this way were shocked by these sanctions. A lot of these countries fear that the US could at some point adopt similar tactics against them. And for that reason, they're trying to move away from holding their reserves in dollars and settling transactions in them. And the most important of these countries right now is China, which is pushing for more international trade to be settled in its own currency, the yuan or the renminbi. And it seems to have started offloading the huge amounts of US debt that it holds. It's not just enemies of the United States that are moving away from dollars. Allies are doing it too, most notably Saudi Arabia. In 1973, the US and Saudi Arabia did a deal whereby the US would provide Saudi Arabia with weapons, and in exchange, Saudi Arabia would sell its crude oil in dollars. The Saudis would recycle these dollars into the American system by buying US Treasury and bonds. This is what's called the petrodollar system, and it's been a linchpin of the dominance of the US dollar ever since. There are signs that things are changing now and that Saudi Arabia is moving closer to China. China recently brokered a historic peace deal between Iran and Saudi Arabia, two countries that have been hostile to each other for decades. Saudi Arabia is also interested in joining the BRICS countries, an alliance of the emerging economies of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. India, another United States ally and member of the BRICS, is also increasingly settling international transactions in rupees too. So in essence, the status of the dollar as the dominant global reserve currency and currency for international settlement is being challenged right now. And that status of the dollar as the global reserve gives the US certain advantages. It can borrow money more cheaply than other countries. This allows the US to accumulate a lot of debt, which it couldn't otherwise. At the same time, of course, it does come with certain costs too. It hurts US manufacturing, for example, when it keeps the dollar high. But taken together, this process is called de-dollarization. And since the US Pluto return in 2022 and those sanctions, it has been gathering pace. Also, more than half of the world's central banks are said to be developing central bank digital currencies. These are likely to make it even easier for them to move away from the dollar if they want to. And a lot of analysts are promoting the idea that the dollar's days as the global reserve currency are numbered. One of the most prominent is the billionaire Ray Dalio, who's famously argued that the US dollar is in danger of being replaced by the Chinese yuan as international reserve currency. Now, something to bear in mind is this isn't something that can happen overnight. A lot of analysts don't even think it's possible anytime soon. And there are costs as well as benefits to having the global reserve currency, and China is aware of many of these costs. And the BRICS countries are also said to be working on other kinds of alternative currency based on a basket of commodities, for example. What isn't in doubt is that the US dollar's dominance is falling. Today, 60% of foreign exchange reserves are held in dollars. In 2000, it was 70%. So it is possible that in the future, we may well see 2022, the year of those exact hits of Pluto in the second house of the US chart, as being the beginning of the end of the dominance of the dollar. We shall see. But one last thing, the US Pluto return we've been talking about is the return of Pluto to its position at the Declaration of Independence in 1776. But the US at that time still hadn't even won its War of Independence, and it would take many years before it achieved it. And it wasn't until 1789 that the US established its governing institutions, the presidency, Congress, the Supreme Court. Pluto won't reach where it was in 1789 until 2035. So that means that we're rather a long way from being able to say that the United States has finished its Pluto return. That said, if you are from the United States and what I've said makes you feel nervous, just bear in mind, we saw the example of England. It's been through many Pluto returns before. They weren't always easy, but people made it through, and you can too. That's it for this episode. Thanks, and see you next time.